Battle of Stalingrad is a two-player game that covers the German summer offensive of 1942 and the Soviet counteroffensive that surrounded and destroyed the German Sixth Army. The game is part of Turning Point Simulations series based on Mitchell and Creasy's book 20 Decisive Battles of the World. The game includes an 11 by 17-inch mounted map board, 216 9/16ths of an inch counters, 6 8.5 by 11-inch cardstock sheets containing various displays and player aids, a 12-page rulebook, a counter tray that doubles as the bottom of the game box, and a 6-sided die. The Battle of Stalingrad is a two-player game. It can be played reasonably well in solitaire mode, but the game is best played with two players since it relies on hidden unit strengths which are kept track of in various player aids. Although the map is small, you will need additional table space to accommodate the numerous player aids that come with the game. Each hex on the map represents 33 kilometers from side to side, and each turn 2 weeks of real time. The terrain types in this game are few. Most hexes are clear terrain, and there are major rivers, minor and minor and major cities. 3 of the major cities are victory objectives in this game. These are Kharkov, Astrakhan, and of course, Stalingrad. The area of the Caucasus is represented by a series of interconnected boxes referred to as Caucasus boxes. These boxes show how many Axis and Soviet units may exist in each box, as well as the maximum number of Axis assets allowed. Lines connect the boxes to other Caucasus boxes as well as to boxes that represent Soviet front edges such as the Southwest and Voronezh fronts, the Don and Stalingrad fronts, and the Transcaucasus front. For each of these fronts there is an area in the Soviet display. Each turn in the game is divided into a Soviet player turn, followed by an Axis player turn. Contrary to most Eastern Front games, in this game the Soviets move first in each turn. Also, the order in which the phases occur is different for each player. There is a special one-time-only Operation Uranus phase, where the Soviets can execute an additional movement phase anytime from turn 9 or later. This extra movement phase gives the Soviets the opportunity to surround Axis units and put them out of supply. If Operation Uranus is declared on turn 9, only 1 unit can move. If it is declared on turn 10, 2 units may move, and if declared on turn 11 or later, 3 units may move. Only if the Soviets launch Operation Uranus, the Axis player then receives 2 special reinforcement units, the German corps of Hollet and Freter-Pico. If at the start of any Axis player turns, the Axis controls Stalingrad, or Astrakhan, with a supplied combat unit, the game ends and the Axis player wins. The Axis player also wins if at the end of the game he has a supplied combat unit adjacent to the Volga River. On the other hand, if at the start of any Soviet player turn, the Soviet player controls Kharkov with a supplied combat unit, the game ends immediately with a Soviet player win. If the Axis and Soviets fail to comply with these sudden death conditions, victory points are tallied to see if the Soviets win or if there is a draw. And if this happens, the best result that the Axis player can obtain is a draw. And this only happens if the Axis score 180 victory points or more. The number of victory points received is affected also by Hitler directives. This is a game mechanism that sets the priorities of objectives for the Axis player. In this game, only the Axis player scores victory points, and there are 3 sources of victory points based on objectives. That is, the Caucasus, Stalingrad, and Don victory points. Caucasus victory points are scored for having at least 1 supplied Axis unit in certain Caucasus boxes at the end of the Axis player turn. 1 Don victory point is scored for each Soviet unit destroyed within the Axis logistical zone. This is the zone of gray hexes that can be seen here on the map. 1 Stalingrad victory point is scored for each turn in which at least one Axis unit is in Stalingrad, even if the unit is unsupplied and even if the Axis does not control Stalingrad. Hitler directives determine primary, secondary, and tertiary status as to each kind of objective victory points. Victory points for a primary objective are tripled, those for a secondary objective are doubled, and those for a tertiary objective remain basic. In this game, there are units and assets. Units represent the major formations during the campaign. Here in the left side, we see a German Panzer Corps, the 3rd Panzer Corps, and the Soviet 56th Army. Each one of these are units, and they are placed on the map. Here we see 2 units, the 56th Soviet Army and the 4th German Infantry Corps. The Soviet unit has 2 ratings in the bottom of the counter. This one is the tactical movement rating, and the 2 is the strategic movement rating. The Axis or German unit has 3 values: the tactical movement rating, strategic movement rating, and this is the strategic movement rating if this German unit is moving throughout its movement phase through the Axis logistical zone, which is the gray area on the map. The counters that we see at right are assets. These represent smaller formations, and they are not placed on the map but on unit displays. Here we have the 11th Panzer Division with a combat strength of 6, and the dots signify the number of steps the unit has. Here we have the 4th Tank Corps, and it has a strength of 6. Assets are assigned to units, and that is done in the unit display. This is the 3rd German Panzer Corps, and it starts the game in hex 0815. As we see here, the 3rd Panzer Corps is part of the 1st Panzer Armee. The basic strength of the corps is 6, and all Axis corps start at their maximum strength. In addition to the basic strength, assets can be assigned to each corps. And this particular corps can hold 2 assets, and in this case we see 2 panzer divisions, the 11th and the 13th, each with a combat strength of 8, which are assigned to the 3rd Panzer Corps, giving it a total strength of 22 combat factors. All Axis units begin at full strength, that is, their strength marker is placed in the highest value for each of the starting units. On the other hand, the Soviets begin the game with 15 units, and the Soviet player allocates 49 strength points among them. Player assign assets to their units. Once an asset is assigned to a particular unit, it shares its fate. Anti-tank assets reduce the effectiveness of enemy armor in combat. There is 1 slot per unit for an anti-tank asset. Different from other assets, anti-tank assets do not move with the unit to which they are assigned. Once the unit moves, the anti-tank asset is placed in its side's off-map reserve box. The game uses a concept similar to that of zones of control, referred to as zones of interdiction. Each unit has a zone of interdiction that projects into its 6 adjacent number hexes. Zones of interdiction, however, do not project into a major city, into or from a Caucasus box, into or from an off-map holding box, nor across any river, minor or major. In addition, units in battle spaces do not project a zone of interdiction. A unit in a major city with a river running through it, such as Stalingrad, Voronezh, Rostov, or Astrakhan, does project a zone of interdiction, unless said city is also a battle space. Zones of interdiction affect the tracing of supply and strategic movement, as we will see further ahead. Supply is essential for the well-being of units in this game. Supply status is determined for a unit at the instant the unit is considered during the reinforcement, replacement, and movement phases. The Axis draws supply from the western edge of the map. The Soviets draw supply from any of the three front edges. A unit is either supplied or unsupplied. Units are printed on both sides. The unit's front side is its supplied side. When a unit becomes unsupplied, it is flipped to its back side, which shows a stripe across the unit. A unit's unsupplied side may show that it has no tactical movement factors. Units will not be eliminated in this game solely by remaining unsupplied. However, unsupplied units suffer various penalties. They may not receive nor transfer assets, and they may not receive replacements. Some units, like this German Panzer Corps, have a 1 in brackets on their unsupplied side. This unit may attempt to move using unsupplied tactical movement. To be eligible to attempt such movement, all assets attached to the unit must be eliminated first. Then, a 1d6 is rolled, and the die result is compared to the unit's current basic strength. Only if the result is equal or greater to the unit's current strength may the unit move 1 hex. Units using strategic movement can move longer distances, but with some restrictions. They may not cross a major river, nor enter or leave an enemy zone of interdiction, nor enter or leave an enemy-occupied or battle space, nor enter or leave a Caucasus box. Tactical movement is a slower type of movement, but it allows units to enter into combat and move into an enemy unit's zone of interdiction. Units using tactical movement may cross major rivers, enter and leave enemy zones of interdiction, and enter an enemy-occupied space. When a friendly unit enters a hex solely occupied by an enemy unit, we place a compulsory attack marker there to remind us to resolve combat in the upcoming combat phase. To resolve combat, we compare the strengths of the attacking units and those of the defending units. As we see here, the 3rd Panzer Corps has a basic strength of 6 plus 16 combat factors from its assets for a total strength of 22. The 13th Soviet Army has a basic strength of 3 and no assets assigned to it. We divide 22 between 3, and that would be around 7-1. The table with the largest combat ratio is this one, which is a 5-1, so we use this table. And the Axis, which is the attacker, will roll on the row corresponding to the number of combat factors it is using. 22, so it would roll on this row. A 2 is rolled, and it gives us a result of 4, so 4 steps are eliminated from the Soviet unit. Now the Soviet unit fires with the original strength it has, 3 combat factors. It would roll a die and consult this column. The roll of 4 produces no loss factors on the Axis side. Now we take account of the losses suffered by the Soviet Army. The 13th Army only has 3 factors, so it is eliminated from the map, and it is placed in the dead pile. It is now eligible to return to the game by the expenditure of replacement points. There may occur situations in this game that after absorbing losses, both sides still have units in the battle hex. In this case, during their respective turns, each of the sides can bring more units into the hex since there are no stacking restrictions on the map. In the next turn, the Soviet player could bring additional units into the battle hex, and that would not mandatorily trigger combat because there were friendly units in the battle hex before the new units moved in. In this example, it is the Axis movement phase. They have 3 units in this hex. Panzer Corps cross this minor river into the hex occupied by the 65th Soviet Army. This results in a river assault. That means that the Axis has to attack in the combat phase. Each Panzer Corps has a strength of 22 combat factors, 16 for the assets and 6 for the basic strength. However, because this is a river assault, the combat strength of any armored or panzer assets is halved. So in essence, each corps here would have 14 combat factors for a total of 28. Or it would appear 28, but the Soviets have an anti-tank unit as part of the assets of the 65th Army. That means that the panzer factors are halved one more time. So now the panzer factors are halved, and instead of having 32, they are halved twice, so they have 8 plus 12 points for the basic strength for a total of 20. 20 compared to the strength of the 65th Army, which is 4, plus 2 for the 140th Brigade is 6. 20 between 6, it is a 3-to-1 attack. We consult the 3-to-1 table, and the axis rolls here in this column for 20 factors. The result is a 5, so the Soviets lose 5 steps, and the Soviets must be retreated. The defenders have 6 combat factors, so they roll on the 6 to 12 column. The result is also a 5. They cause 3 step losses on the Axis units. Now the Soviets must remove 5 steps. If they eliminate the 65th Army, all attached assets are also lost. So they decide first to eliminate the anti-tank asset with 1 dot. It satisfies 1 step. The tank brigade also has 1 dot. It satisfies the 2nd step. And the last 3 steps to be removed come from the 65th Army, and its strength is reduced to 1, but it is still in the game. Now it is the end of the Axis player turn, and we remove the compulsory river assault marker. We still have units from both sides in the hex, so this is still a battle space. Now the Axis player has to absorb 3 step losses. A word about the 8 strength Panzer Division assets. If any of these assets takes a step loss, it is not flipped to its other side, but substituted for this counter with a strength of 6. And if this counter takes another step loss, it is flipped to its 3 strength side. These 8 strength Panzer Division assets can never be rebuilt to their full original strength of 8, but only to their 6 strength side. In addition, the Axis player has only a limited number of these very powerful Panzer divisions, so protecting them throughout the game is of the utmost importance. So in this particular case, the Axis player will take the 3 step losses from the basic strength of his 2 units. In this example, in the Axis movement phase, the 51st German Infantry Corps moves into Stalingrad and enters the hex occupied by the Soviet 62nd Army, and this results in a compulsory attack. The 51st Corps has a base strength of 6, but there's also the 17th Panzer Division attached, which contributes 6 more strength points, but because Stalingrad is a major city, the assets' strength factors are halved, so the 51st Corps has a strength of 9 combat factors. The 62nd Soviet Army has a strength of 4 with no assets attached, so this is a 2-to-1 attack. The Germans with 9 factors roll on the 6 to 12 column. They roll a 6, causing 3 loss factors on the Soviets. The Soviets roll on the 5 or less column for their 4 factors. They roll a 3, no losses on the Axis side. So the Soviets have to lose 3 factors, all come from the 62nd Army's basic strength. It only has now a strength of 1. It is the end of the Axis turn, so the compulsory marker is now removed. It is now turn 7 for the Soviets, the first half of October, and they receive 14 replacement points in addition to a number of reinforcing units and assets. And the Soviets receive these replacements and reinforcements before moving or causing combat. The rules mandate that replacement points available in a turn have to be used in that turn or they are lost. Of the 14 replacement points, the Soviet player uses 5 to strengthen the 62nd Army to its maximum strength of 6. The 47th Soviet Army enters the game as a reinforcement, and replacement points are used to rebuild the 24th and 56th Soviet armies. All three armies now move in the direction of Stalingrad. It is now the German player's 7th turn, and the 3rd Panzer Corps will use tactical movement, moving 2 hexes and entering the Stalingrad battle space. The 3rd Panzer Corps is fighting in a major city, so the strength of its panzer assets is halved. It is 6 plus 5 for its basic strength. It has a strength of 11, which is added to the strength of the 51st Corps, which has panzer assets which are also halved and has a strength of 9. 11 and 9 is 20. The strength of the 62nd Army is 6. So this is 20 against 6. This is a 3-to-1 attack. The Germans roll on the 13 to 26 row because they have 20 combat factors. They roll a 5. The Soviets lose 5 steps and have a retreat result. The Soviets with 6 combat factors roll on the 6 to 12 column. They roll a 4. They cause a loss of 2 factors on the Germans. The 62nd Army has to lose 5 factors, so it goes back to a strength of 1 more time. It does not have to retreat because Stalingrad is a major city, so it stays put. The Germans lose 2 factors. They reduce the basic strength of the 3rd Panzer Corps by 1 and also reduce by 1 the strength of the 51st Corps. Now the game moves on to turn number 8, and the Soviets receive 15 replacement points and additional reinforcements. And the Battle of Stalingrad rages on, with the Soviets hanging by the nails to the city. The Battle of Stalingrad has some uncommon and interesting game mechanics in a game of this size. It is foremost a strategic level game where Russian armies and German corps are the main protagonist, but there are smaller formations represented in the game as assets that provide much color and personality. In this game there are no overruns, double impulse, or mechanized movement phases for the Axis player. The victory conditions mandate the Axis to advance to the Volga as quickly as possible, before the massive number of Soviet reinforcements and replacements make their effect. Thus, the Axis player is forced to attack all along the front and early on. If the Axis destroys enough Soviet armies early in the game, the Soviet player may not have enough units to form a line. Worse yet, large holes in the line can be exploited by German panzer corps using their strategic movement, especially in the movement-friendly Axis logistical supply zone. The Axis player depends on his panzer assets, but they are prohibitively expensive to rebuild at 3 replacement points per step. Thus, they must be protected at all times. Because the combat factors of Axis panzer assets are halved in major cities, taking Stalingrad or Astrakhan with them is easier said than done, and they will suffer heavy casualties in city fighting, and by the time they get to Stalingrad or Astrakhan, the Axis will have very few replacement points left. The Soviets, on the other hand, must avoid having scores of armies wiped out at the beginning of the game. The Soviets have the advantage of moving first, and the Soviet player can trade space for time, pulling back armies to avoid early destruction and forcing the Axis to attack them with the only units that can reach them, the precious panzer corps, in this way wearing them down gradually. The Axis player will most probably aim for Stalingrad, since Astrakhan lies farther away to the southeast. The Soviet player must defend Stalingrad at all costs. Even if Axis units take Stalingrad during their turn, the Axis player does not win the game unless he maintains control of the city at the beginning of his next turn. As long as Soviet units are adjacent to Stalingrad, the Soviet player may constantly send units into the city, preventing a sudden death Axis victory. The Soviet player must feed the Stalingrad meat grinder, keeping the battle for the city alive until he is able to unleash his counteroffensive. The battle space mechanic serves well to simulate the prolonged city fighting that characterized the Battle in Stalingrad. This game is of medium complexity that can be played in solitary mode, although it is more enjoyable as a two-player game, simply because of the surprises that bring fighting an enemy whose strength is unknown. I hope that you have enjoyed this video and it has given you a sense of how this game plays and what it has to offer. Thanks for watching.